Love to see your face, Anandini and Ella and Linda, but if you can't, I totally understand. You know, it's kind of interesting, but last week, a friend of mine called me up and asked me about how to apologize. And then that turned into me doing a apologizing for dummies guide. And this week, the same friend called me up and said, you know, I went through that whole apologizing exercise with somebody I had wronged. And, you know, now I'm wondering, how do I forgive them? Because they also wronged me. And so it was interesting, but the act of apologizing resulted in this devotee wanting to figure out how to forgive. So let me just say that again, because I think I bungled my words just slightly. Last week, somebody called me up and wanted to know how to make a proper apology. And so I discussed that with them, and then I opened it up to you guys that evening because it was on my mind. This week, just a few hours ago, the same friend called me up and said, I went and apologized, made amends, wrote and spoke with the person who I'd wronged. And the result is now that I want to forgive them, but I don't know how to do it. Did you guys follow that? So one is I want to be forgiven, and the other one is I want to forgive. And interestingly, this person started off wanting to be forgiven, but then a week later he's like, well, how do I forgive them? They also wronged me. How do I forgive them? And so that's what I thought that we would discuss. Howard's trying to get online. If somebody can, does somebody have the ability to put Howard online? I'm hoping they do. Are you doing that, Nandini?
Howard is saying that the volume is low.
Kim writes in that it's okay on her end.
Okay.
I think he's logged in through Facebook Live.
I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. How low, Howard? I'll up my volume, but I don't know what this is going to do. It is what it is.
Sorry, I'll switch devices.
I'm going to keep going. But thank you for writing in, speaking. I thought we would do a little something on how to forgive others. I thought we'd spend a little time with that today. I thought there might be some value in that. So here we go. This is forgiving. Instead of apologizing for dummies, this is a forgiving 101, or the idiot's guide to forgiving, or whatever we decide to call it. We'll see what happens. We'll see what the fancy that strikes us when we finish. I guess the first thing we should do is define what forgiveness is. And a good definition defines what something is and what it is not. That way the definition is narrow enough that other stuff isn't included, but it's broad enough that everything that should be included is included. Proper forgiveness involves a voluntary reduction in negative feelings towards somebody. So you might resent them, you might feel vengeful, even justifiably vengeful. You may feel resentment, which is anger towards somebody for a perceived wrong. These types of emotions. You have some negative emotion towards that person for some perceived injustice. And those emotions go down. People feel less of that. And then correspondingly, and not everybody agrees on this, There's psychologists who specialize in forgiveness. Generally, they're in the field of positive psychology. Not everybody agrees on this, but I'm of the camp that believes that there has to be a concomitant increase in wishing well on the person. That the mere reduction of negative sentiments without a positive, I wish them well, I think ends up being somewhat delusional. I don't think that you reduce negative sentiments and go to a 0 point of numbness. I think that usually involves some kind of suppression that eventually will need to come out. If you have enough heat with somebody that you resent them, you don't just go back to not feeling anything. And so you have to have some, I wish them well. However remote, there's a decrease in negative sentiments like resentment, anger, and vengeance. And there's an increase in positive sentiments, such as compassion and empathy. And at the very least, altruistic love, a detached love, wishing them well. So that's a literal definition of resentment as it occurs in the literature, along with a little bit of nuance and how different theorists discuss it. And then there's a few approaches. There's kind of a decision-based approach, which is where you make a decision to forgive the person. There's a cognitive approach where you reframe the way you think about what happened. And then there's an affective approach or an emotional approach where you try to deal with your emotional response to how you feel about it. Of course, the problem with just saying, I decide to forgive somebody is a lot of times that doesn't remove the negative feeling that you may be experiencing. So the decision-based approach is a great starting point, but it's definitely not the end product. And so a full definition of forgiveness involves both this deciding to forgive somebody, there's a voluntary aspect to it, and then you also feel better about the situation than the other party. I guess we'll back up for a second and we'll describe what forgiveness is not. Forgiveness is not condoning. Condoning means you're justifying the person's behavior. It's not condoning. A lot of times people have a hard time forgiving because they feel like if they forgive, they're condoning what the other person did. You're not. That's why it's a different word. Because it's a different thing. Also, sometimes people think if they forgive, they're excusing. Excusing means you're blaming somebody else. You're excusing their behavior. You're no longer holding them accountable for what they did. Forgiveness, again, is not excusing, which is why we have a different word for it. Forgiveness is not pardoning. Pardoning is a legal term that's used when you... and sometimes the word forgiveness is actually used in a legal sense too. You might forgive somebody's debt. But pardoning is a legal term where you are in a position of authority in some sort of judicial structure, and you are the arbiter of whether the person is held accountable for the crimes or not. Forgiveness is not pardoning. It's not forgetting. It's not forgetting. Forgiveness is not forgetting. And so, forgiveness is not forgetting, condoning, excusing, or pardoning. It's also not reconciling, which is restoring a relationship. That's also a separate thing. It's a more advanced stage. Forgiveness is a precursor to a reconciliation, but it is not the whole thing. Reconciliation involves a reestablishment of trust in a relationship. So now that we've defined what forgiveness is and what it is not, By the way, I also, as I'm looking at you guys, I'm talking to you, it doesn't seem like you guys are able to follow this real easily. It seems like a lot of information. It shouldn't be. We should all have black belts in forgiveness, as well as in apologizing. We should understand what forgiveness is. It's a voluntary, cognitive, decision, behavioral based, and also emotional, letting go of negative feelings such as bitterness and resentment and anger towards a perceived injustice. And it goes along with a corresponding increase in well-wishing feelings such as compassion and empathy and even altruistic love towards the party that wronged you. It's not condoning, excusing, pardoning, forgetting, or reconciling. We should understand it well enough that we can explain it like that to somebody. Because you need to, they say, it's funny, there's that famous quote by Alexander Pope, the incredibly famous English poet. To err is human, to forgive divine. And so forgiveness is it's a big deal. Gandhi said, weak people can't forgive. It's an attribute of the strong. Chanakya, the Indian ethicist, he said that the song of the cuckoo makes it beautiful. The cuckoo is not a particularly beautiful bird, but it sings very beautifully. And there's actually a kokila bun. There's a kokila is the Indian word for cuckoo, Sanskrit word for cuckoo. There's a forest of cuckoo birds. In Vrindavan, it's one of the 12 forests. You go there when you go on Brajmanda Parikrama. They sound very beautiful when you hear them. The song makes the cuckoo beautiful. Chastity makes the wife beautiful. Knowledge makes the ugly person beautiful. And forgiveness makes the sadhu beautiful. The Brahmins are known, they're famous in the Bhagavatam for their forgiveness. The forgiveness of the Brahmins is like the sunshine to the sun, according to the Bhagavatam. Just as the sunshine is a natural attribute or feature of the sun, forgiveness is the natural feature of the Brahmana. It's what they're known for. It's what it beautifies sadhus. The Mahabharata says that amongst the weak, forgiveness is a virtue, and amongst the strong, it's their ornament. And if you hold the sword of forgiveness in your hand, what can a wicked person do to you? You become invulnerable. There's nothing that forgiveness cannot accomplish. These are kind of statements from our tradition. There's the whole Christian idea of forgiveness, which is also very much linked to God's forgiveness of us. So therefore, when you forgive, you're becoming divine because you're participating in the nature of divine compassion, mercy, grace, forgiveness. These are attributes of how God feels towards us. And so when you embody them yourself in your own life, you then become divine-like. And to be petty and miserly and exacting is the opposite. Anyway, when people make a decision, I want to forgive, I'm going to forgive, a lot of times then they're bummed because it doesn't change anything and they still have these negative feelings. So one of the things positive psychology has found is that you have to educate people on the value of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. Forgiveness is letting someone out of prison only to discover that the prisoner was you. Yeah. So one of the things you do, once somebody's like, I want to forgive, you glorify forgiveness. Either you get them to the point where they want to forgive, or to really help them dig in and galvanize that feeling that they should forgive and turn it into something that you can actually work with. You have to prep the soil before the seed will sprout. You have to water it before the seed will sprout. And so orienting ourselves on the value of forgiveness. And so with Western thought, with, Western poetry and what have you, you can quote Gandhi, or you can quote Pope, or stuff like that. And people are like, wow, that's great, Or, you could do the other one, which is, resentment is like taking poison and hoping the other person will die. You give people little one-liners like this, like, oh yeah, that makes sense. We have an added thing. We have a whole wisdom tradition that goes back thousands of years that many of us hold as sacred. And so when we quote from our tradition, forgiveness is the beauty of the sages. It's the natural attribute of the Brahmana, just as the sunlight is the attribute of the sun. It pleases Krishna. That with the sword of forgiveness in hand, how can anyone harm you in the world? That it's virtue if you're weak, and it's an ornament if you're strong. Because you could, if you're weak, you couldn't do anything about it, but it's virtuous that you're still willing to forgive. If you're strong, you could do something, but you don't, and therefore it's an ornament, and it further beautifies you. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. These are ways of kind of warming us up. So like, oh, I want to forgive. Like, sign me up. Anyway, either the person decides they want to forgive, but they don't really mean it, and you got to convince them to mean it, or they don't even want to commit to forgiving, and so you got to warm them up. And these are the types of things that warm people up, including ourselves. We forcibly broaden our minds and the minds of others by reflecting on the power of forgiveness and the benefit of it. We realize that, there's a whole nother side of it. Forgiveness, resentment enmeshes you with the other party. It creates a heat and a bond between you and the other party. A powerful bond that connects you to them in a very primal way. And so forgiveness is about moving forward in your own life and letting go of the other party. Sometimes we don't want to let go, so we hold on to resentment, hoping they'll come back. I've discussed that at length in other places. I'm not going to do it today. But it keeps us connected. And forgiveness is really setting yourself free and moving forward. I was many, many years ago. I think it was before I even joined the temple. So it was 30 plus years ago. There was this black lady in Philadelphia who got raped over 3 days by some guy who broke into her apartment. She went to the hospital. It broke like every bone in her face. She got to the hospital a month later, and of course the news reporters were there like rats. And they interviewed her, They caught the guy. How do you feel? What do you want to have happen to him? She said, I forgive him. And they were just aghast. The newspaper reporters just could not fathom that this woman who had been, grotesquely abused and assaulted in the most vile way was just able to walk out of the hospital and say to people, I forgive them. It was like the greatest quote I've ever seen. They said, how can you forgive this person? She said, hey, he took 3 days of my life. I'm not giving him anymore. It was a practical decision. It was very pragmatic. there was very little utility in holding on to resentment, and she wanted to move forward. Actually, it's a whole thing. People who had, I don't know how much you guys know about attachment theory and parenting, but essentially, attachment is the desire to be close to somebody. Children form attachment to their parents. We form attachment to people in life. It has incredible neurobiological benefits, oxytocin levels, dopamine, serotonin regulation. So many things get increased by being close to people that we care about, people that we become attached to. And so people who've had healthy relationships and attachments when they were young, usually we're talking like in the 1 to 3 plus year range is usually where attachment theory comes in like most powerfully. I'm spot on with this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just looking at my developmental psychologist friend for a nod of approval, for a little validation. If you've had strong attachment figures and healthy attachment relationships early on in life, then you're able to forgive more readily. And people who haven't tend to hold grudges, and they're not able to forgive, and they're not able to hold on to it. Maybe they have moments where they want to forgive, but they can't hold it. They descend back down into this begrudging, ruminating mood where they just can't let go of stuff and becomes almost obsessive and a type of neurosis. People with neuroticism, if you're a fan of the Big Five personality traits, which is a fairly recent theory in psychology, people with a neuroticist perspective tend to find it harder to forgive because they get too in their heads and they think about it a lot. But anyway, not everybody, it's not the same for everybody. Some people have a lot harder time forgiving. Just like some people can naturally run like a gazelle and others can't. So they got to work harder at learning how to run. They got to focus more on the that hand-eye coordination that's involved in running, that mind-body connection that's involved in running. Some people have it harder to just find it harder to let go, to move forward, to let go of pain, to not hold grudges. Narcissists have a hard time forgiving because it wounds their pride, and so they have a harder time dealing with it. But anyway, irrespective of that, you need to understand what forgiving is, a lessening of negative emotions and an increase of positive ones. You got to realize what it's not: pardoning, condoning, excusing, forgetting, reconciling. You got to understand the value of it, either innately, because how you were raised in a forgiving culture. Christians are sometimes just blow my mind with their capacity for an innate predilection, almost like their innate predisposition towards forgiving people. It's like they're addicted to forgiving. It's like their basic typology. It's incredible sometimes when you see strong Christians and their capacity for forgiveness. It's impressive because it's bred into them. So some people are raised to forgive, either purposefully by their parents who held it as a high virtue, or because they just had healthy relationships growing up and it makes it easier for them to let go and move forward. For some people it's harder, but we got to wrap our heads around the value in forgiving. We got to really start to see that to err is human and to forgive is divine. And we have to orient ourselves around that theoretically and then make the decision. I want to forgive. And then, once you've done that, you need to look at forgiveness as a process. It's not an on-off switch. It's not cheap. It's not something you do for a weekend and a seminar and then you're done and you get your certificate, your forgiveness certificate, and now you're a qualified forgiver. Forgiveness is a process. Time is your friend in that process, if you use it right. Krishna says there's forgiveness in the Gita, in the 10th chapter. Kshama is the Sanskrit word for forgiveness. It's the same word for tolerance. When you apologize to someone, you ask them to tolerate you. You ask them to endure you or tolerate you. When you say please, it's the same word. Kshama, kshama yatam. It's the same word, please, and forgiveness, and tolerance. And so Krishna identifies himself with kshama. It's a feminine word in Sanskrit. Kshama. From ksham, which means to endure, tolerate. Actually, kshanti also very much means forgiveness as well. And Krishna identifies it in the Gita as a quality of the Brahmanas. Tapa, what is it? Samadama tapa shocham, kshantir. Kshantir, it's one of the qualities of the Brahmanas in the Gita. Actually, one of the qualities of a devotee who loves Krishna. The first quality of a devotee who loves Krishna, kshantir, avyarta. Kshanti, avyarta kalabam. You don't waste a minute, and you forgive. It's, in many ways, synonymous with the development of love for Krishna. Maybe we'll get to that at the end of class, if we get that far. Yeah, we have so much. The Christians, they really orient their kids towards it. But if you look at our sacred text with an eye towards seeing this, it's all over the place. It's all over the place. I think in some ways, if you look at Indian people in general, the whole billion people of India, maybe excluding the Muslims, and I'm just being whatever, slightly bigoted, but the Muslim people killed 100 million Hindus. It was the largest genocide in the history of the world. It was the Muslim occupation of India. They destroyed so many of our temples. And they're not famous in India for forgiving. They represent 13% of the population. But if you look within in Hindu society, Jain society, Buddhist society within India, the majority of the Indian population and the religions of the East, it's almost like everybody is just raised to forgive. And so it's almost in their DNA to be tolerant, to forgive, to let go, to move forward. And I think for that reason, maybe it doesn't get quite as much attention. When you get these real tribal cultures where you're smiting and smoting people and God's angry and he's punishing the wicked and there's plagues and so on and so forth, and you gotta kill the non-believers and the infidels and the heathens and the goyim or beneath you and stuff like that, then you gotta specify forgiveness and spend a lot of time on it because you're raising people with your theology to be intolerant. And so you have to do a big, almost like unphilosophical 180 and teach people to forgive. In a lot of ways, Christianity is a radical 180. Anyway, and then Islam is another 180. But I don't want to turn this into a comparative religious discussion. I think one of the reasons why, because as I'm just thinking it through, it's like it's all over our sacred texts. But I think everybody's imbibed it so much that it doesn't wind up on the front news because it's like you're not the body. It's something that everybody culturally accepts a priori at the outset. But as I'm going through, I'm like, wow, we have like everything the Bible has and more on this topic. So we understand what forgiveness is, what it's not. We either decide we want to forgive or somebody convinces us to. We make that decision, but then our emotions fall behind. And so understanding forgiveness is a process, and time can be your friend in it, provided you do the right things. Time can also callous and harden and make your grudges like steel cables binding you if you don't do it right. If you have that ruminate, grudge-holding personality, then sometimes time works against you. So, I guess another point is that forgiveness really has nothing to do with the other party. Restorative justice involves the other party. There's all sorts of things that involve the other party. But forgiveness, it can be a one-woman show. Ram forgave Kaikeyi without her ever apologizing. Kaikeyi colluded. Her machinations led to Ram's banishment to the forest and the death of his father. Then Ram came back and Kaikeyi fell at his feet and begged for forgiveness, but before she could, Ram fell at her feet and said how happy he was to see her. He had no ill will. You don't require the other party to participate. You don't require the other person to participate. So anyway, we orient ourselves around the idea of forgiving. And then there's a couple of steps that are really important. One is you start to empathetically look at the other party who wronged you. And there's a few things that have to happen. You have to actually look honestly at what they did. A lot of times when we feel angry or resentful, we explode and sensationalize what the other party did to us until it becomes, just like sometimes people meet their molesters, the person who molested them as a child, or sexually abused a child, they meet the person who molested them. Now they're 6'2", and the other guy's 5'7". Forgive me for being bigoted against men, but they are 95+% of the sexual abusers in the world. And so you see the other guy, and he's like 5'6" or 5'5", and you outweigh him by 100 pounds, and you could crush him in one hand like a grape. But in your mind, he was like 8 feet tall and 400 pounds, some kind of juggernaut. So we disproportionate things. And so this cognitive aspect where you really think through what happened. And then you think about the other person, and you think about things from their point of view. And you make sure you're not being hypocritical. And you look at your own, and you gotta look at them, you gotta look at yourself. You look at yourself and you look at your own culpability. Actually, even positive psychology understands, they call it, they have a name for it, it's like benefit finding. Benefit finding, which essentially means you look at the valuable lessons that you've learned through the process. Of course, you have to learn those lessons. You can't just fake it. You got to actually go for it. Viktor Frankl was a master at this. He went through Auschwitz and came out the other end having learned a lot of valuable lessons. And of course, there are valuable lessons because Krishna loves you and never gives you anything that you don't deserve and more. And so whatever you get in life, you deserve it. And if you're able to see it clearly, you're able to see how you deserve it, either from what you did usually in this lifetime, but if it happened when you were a kid, it was something you must have done in your last lifetime. And you look at the incredible lessons you can learn from it, and then you're able to move forward. Unfortunately, there is no way to blame the boogeyman and not hold yourself accountable without ultimately blaming God. Because if Krishna made one person who didn't get abused as a kid, and then made somebody else who did get abused as a kid, and you don't want to go the mysterium tremendum route, where it's like this tremendous mystery that you can't work out why God is such a jerk. Like if a parent let one kid get molested, but then save the other kid, and just chose, like this one, let this one happen to this, and let this one not happen. It's not that they didn't know, they chose, because God's omniscient, so he knows. So God chose omnisciently to let you suffer for no good reason as a child, and chose to have somebody else not suffer. And the proof he chose not let somebody else not suffer is somebody else lived in the world who didn't undergo the abuse you underwent. So now you're left in a situation where this all-powerful deity, who's also all-knowing, chose to let you suffer and not let the other party suffer. And you can't do it. It's not ignorance. It's not like this or that, because you're dealing with an omniscient, omnipotent being. If you didn't deserve what happened to you, it's like a flow chart. I don't deserve what happened to me. God's a monster. And so ultimately we have to take accountability and hold ourselves accountable. Most of the time we did something in the actual situation. We set ourselves up for the cheating. We set ourselves up for the betrayal. We left ourselves vulnerable. We wanted something for nothing. We wanted somebody to move the chasm from where we are to where we would like to be, and somebody to whisper sweet nothings to us and tell us we were further along in whatever than we actually are. I watched it wasn't Chris Rock, it was Kevin Hart. He's like an extremely well-known comedian. He's so well-known and so popular that he can cheat on his wife and do other stuff like that and be a jerk to his friends and still, be incredibly well-regarded. Anyway, Kevin Hart was talking to his son. I'm sure it was a made-up story, but it's hilarious. Forgive me for this cultural reference that came to mind. But he's talking about his son who thought he was a superhero and used to thought he was Spider-Man, so he'd every time Kevin Hart would do something his son didn't like, and then Kevin Hart would pretend like he got covered by webs, like his son was Spider-Man. So then his son got in a fight at school, got beat up, he's all black and blue. He's like, Dad, I tried to shoot him and it didn't happen. And Kevin's like, man, I messed up my kid by not teaching him how to fight and giving him this, delusions of grandeur. And his son's like, oh, and then later on, Kevin's like, yeah, what went wrong? And his son's like, oh, I didn't turn it on. It was like a joke, it was like a joke. So we think we're like that. We're like little kids who want to feel like we're further along in life than we are. We don't want to put the work in. And then we find people who tell us that we are further along than we actually are, and we buy into it, and we become complicit in the great con game of life. And then when that's exposed, and we're shown to not be deserving of the damning of faint praise. That's another quote from Alexander Pope. When we're exposed, and when the people who glorified us, that we were so happy to buy into, hook, line, and sinker, when they vilify us, we get disturbed. And the cheap praise becomes cheap blame, and we get all bent out of shape. Because we took it on the front end, so we gotta pay on the back end. So most of the time, you can look at this stuff and you can see your culpability. You go back far enough in time, you couldn't have done anything in this lifetime. And then you got to start to look at what, hypothetically must have happened in a previous lifetime. You have to have a workable theory that doesn't involve blaming God. And so when I say wholesale accountability, I really mean it. Most of the time, stuff that happens that you're bent out of shape about, that happened, since the time you were 10 or 15 or something like that, you can start to take some responsibility for it. Maybe closer to 15 and 10. But if it happened before that, it's not so, we have to go back a lifetime. Or several lifetimes. And we have to just theoretically accept I must have done something. And sometimes you have a hypothesis that you can't test out. It's not unreasonable. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but it's not unscientific to have a reasonable hypothesis, coherent, that's still yet untestable. And if there's a way to test stuff, great. But if you can't test stuff, then the best you can do is give a coherent theory, and this is certainly a coherent theory. Benefit finding, culpability. taking responsibility for the situation you found yourself in. These are ways you look at yourself. You look at the other party empathetically. You see things from their perspective. If you see things from their perspective, and doing that makes you realize you would have done the same thing, then you're a hypocrite for being angry at them, and you have to forgive them. Even if they did something you wouldn't have done, you look at their past, you look at them as a victim of their conditioning. You look at their mindset, their issues, and you can see why they did what they did. And by empathetically looking at things from the other party's perspective, which is what people don't want to do if they want to hold on to bitterness. They resist that because, man, it messes you up. That's, by the way, why my friend, you listening, friend? That's why my friend, when he went through the exercise of asking for forgiveness, part of that is empathizing with the other party. You have to empathize with the other party to ask for forgiveness, right? And then you develop a desire to forgive them. Or you have to empathize with them to forgive them, and then you develop a desire to be forgiven by them. But no matter which place you start the process, forgiving the person or being forgiven by the person, it automatically leads to the other one, because both of them involve fundamentally empathizing with the other party and taking responsibility yourself. You take responsibility yourself like an adult, and you empathize with the other person. And you view them differently. It's a cognitive thing. You reframe the way you view them. So you make a decision, but then your mindset has to follow suit with your noble decision. And you have to pay for that. You have to pay for it. And you reframe cognitively the way you look at them, and the way you look at yourself, and the way you look at the situation. And that's the game changer. You get this theoretical orientation towards the value of forgiving. It's either your birthright, or that's the result of educating yourself, even as an adult. Either you got it early on from your parents, or you studied wisdom literature, or thought deeply about the nature of reality, or had some good mentors, whatever it is, and you came up with this idea that, wow, forgiveness is beautiful. And then you decide, it's decision-based forgiveness. I want to forgive. But then you need that cognitive-based forgiveness, and this is the trick. You think about it from the other party's perspective. You think about the situation. You take ownership. All roads lead to Rome. They lead to you forgiving and you trying to be forgiven. And no matter where you start, it's therapeutic and it's prophylactic. One thing leads to the other, and you purify yourself through the process. And then you start to find benefits. And then your emotions fall. That cognitive reframing creates an affective reframing. And you start to feel better about the situation and feel better towards the person. And once that emotional component is there, then the forgiveness has really taken place. You see it as a process, you see the value in it, and then you follow through. Forgiveness makes you incredibly powerful. Tolerance makes you powerful. Detachment is a great friend. It helps you see the bigger picture instead of myopically getting too close to everything. You can step back and see the big picture. You can look at the lessons you need to learn. You can find those benefits. Srila Prabhupada was an expert forgiver. But he loved to lecture on this verse from the Bhagavatam. He quote it all the time. He would say, if a devotee cuts his finger, he feels like I should have cut my arm off. And whatever happens to a devotee, he knows that he deserved worse. And Krishna actually was looking out for him. So the verse is Tate Anukampa Sumikshamana. Sumikshamana means intensely looking for. Anukampa, the Lord's mercy. Intensely looking for the Lord's mercy, the Lord's compassion. Bunjana Ekatma Kritam Vipakam. And enduring whatever happens in life as being self-caused, as being the cooked result that they deserved, the matured fruit of what they deserved. Tate nukampa sumikshamana. Earnestly, always expecting and looking for the Lord's compassion. And simultaneously enduring whatever happens in life as being self-caused. Their words and their actions to the Lord, to you. It's a prayer to Krishna. So you're doing three things. The first two are cognitive. You're always expecting Krishna's mercy. You're expecting it. You're counting it. You're trusting it. You're the trustor. Krishna's the trustee. You're trusting Krishna to be kind to you and merciful. Bunjana ekatma kritam vipakam. And you're accepting that whatever happens to you is the natural result of things you've done. And your response to that is that with your mind, body, and words, you offer your respects to Krishna all the time. Jiveta, if you live like that, one who lives like that, Jiveta, Yamukti Pade Sadoibat. The person who lives like that, their inheritance is liberation. You inherit liberation. You become a son or daughter of Krishna, and therefore liberation becomes your birthright. It becomes your inheritance. Becomes your just desserts. You're always expecting and trusting Krishna's mercy. You're tolerating whatever happened as your responsibility. Either you can trace it out or you can't, but either way you accept it. And if you do that, and then you respond to that by offering your mind, body, and words to Krishna, and you live your life like that, is Sri Vallabha here still? Can you ask him to wait 2 minutes for me? Then if you live like that, the result of living like that is you inherit liberation. That's the natural condition of the soul. Because you do deserve everything you got. And Krishna will always be kind. And you can tolerate anything and learn from anything and grow from anything. And when you look at the world like that, you're seeing things clearly. And when you respond to that by giving your life to Krishna, then liberation becomes your thing. You got to be broad-minded to appreciate it. We're so myopic, we don't want liberation. We want a whole bunch of other stuff. But if you can wrap your head around that as being a valuable thing, and you can look at how this is the condition of liberation, and it's clearly seeing the world the way it actually is. that you are responsible for everything that's happened, that you can grow from anything, and that the person who gave you your karma is just that. They're scripted. Krishna matched you up with somebody who was designed to give you your karma, and you can let it go, and you can move on, and you can be peaceful. You can learn your lessons and make it to the next level of the video game of life. You can level up. And we start small, but eventually it becomes everything like that. And what harm can be done to somebody who holds the saber of forgiveness and tolerance in their hands because they see what's actually going on and the lessons they need to learn, how they brought on themselves, and Krishna's minimizing it. And so as the world goes on, they just fall more and more in love with Krishna. Until the cruel hand of death comes, which for the devotee is experienced as it really is, which is Krishna gently picking you up and bringing you back home. And so tolerance is automatically the byproduct of falling in love with God. Because you see what's actually going on. And you stop playing the blame game because you see the big picture. And you win at the game of life. You forgive everybody. And you see it was all scripted. And everybody was just playing their parts, like Shakespeare said. All the world's a stage and everyone's merely playing their parts. You see that and you forgive everybody. And you win the game of life. And you get to see Krishna and experience his mercy. And that's why forgiving is divine, because it represents seeing the world and everything that's happened in the world as it actually is. Not just a piece of the puzzle. If you take that tapestry and you look at the back of a tapestry, it's just a bunch of like random threads. It makes no sense. And you turn it over and you see what it actually was. It was all those threads at the back that you couldn't tell. It was designed to make that beautiful thing. And then you see it and it all comes together and it's all so clear. All right. That's what I had to say today. I think we'll call it there. I really appreciate you guys giving us your kind attention. Thank you so very much for joining us. And we'll see you tomorrow. Hopefully. Hare Krishna.